My name is Kolin Kish, and this is my ethical theory presentation. The ethical theory I've chosen today is consequentialism. There's the author and the encyclopedic entry. Now, to start off with our definition, the term consequentialism seems to be used as a family resemblance term to refer to any descent of classic utilitarianism that remains close enough to its ancestor in the important respects. So that's kind of a lot there, but basically, consequentialism, it's essentially saying can be a bunch of different theories kind of roped into one. As you can see, there will be many variations, but it's kind of saying that they all stem from utilitarianism, which is kind of like um, you want to do good. That's want to do what is causes the most good, essentially. Any consequentialist theory must accept the claim that I labeled consequentialism, namely that certain normative properties depend only on consequences. So when it says depend only on consequences, that's kind of like what I'm saying with utilitarianism. So it depends only on the outcome, only on how much good it does, and that's essentially what you'll be looking at as the most important thing. Several philosophers assert that a moral theory should not be classified as consequentialist unless it is agent neutral. So essentially, agent neutral means that you remove the agent. You're not looking at who it is specifically. So you're not looking at a perspective. You're looking kind of a broad overview. You'll see we'll get into it, but there's the transplant case. You're not looking at it through the eyes of the doctor. You're just a neutral observer, basically. Um, oops, sorry. And in the end, what matters is only that we get clear about which theories a particular commentator counts as consequentialist or not, and which claims are supposed to make them consequentialist or not. So essentially, that just means that depending who you're talking to, it can really change what's considered consequentialist and what is not. So different people have different viewpoints, like many things in ethics, but essentially, it kind of depends what's considered consequentialist, and you have to look at the author and who's making the claim specifically. And then for our first variation, we have hedonistic consequentialism. So pleasure is distinct from the absence of pain, and pain is distinct from the absence of pleasure. Since sometimes people feel neither pleasure nor pain, and sometimes they feel both at once. So essentially, if you get into hedonism, it's all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. So you want to do what causes the most people the most pleasure, and you kind of want to reduce pain. Now, if you get into the second bullet point here, it says that some critics argue that not all pleasures are valuable, since, for example, there's no value in the pleasures that a sadist gets from whipping a victim or that an addict gets from drugs. So essentially, do these things bring you pleasure? Yes, but you can't argue that, these are good for society or these are even good for you as a person. So this is kind of like an objection, sort of. It's kind of an issue with hedonism that many people find, but essentially if you're just looking at what pleasure is valuable, these are kind of the things like watching TV all day. Sure, that brings you pleasure, but it's not doing good for the world, and it's not helping. Opponents object that not only pleasure are intrinsically valuable because other things are valuable, independent of whether they lead to pleasure or avoid pain. So essentially, it's kind of like knowledge, telling the truth. There's other things that might not be pleasurable in one sense, but they're very valuable. They kind of exist independently of pleasure and pain, like lying. You have to kind of distinguish that because maybe it doesn't bring, pleasure or pain in the act itself, but it can cause other things, and you kind of have to look at the effects of that as well. Um, so our next variation is pluralistic consequential. So many consequentialists deny that all values can be reduced to any single ground, such as pleasure or desire satisfaction, so they instead adopt a pluralistic theory of value. So you're basically looking at many different things, instead of just looking at the hedonism, you're kind of looking at multiple different things in order to determine the best action. So consequentialists add the intrinsic value of friendship or love, freedom or ability, justice or fairness, desert life, virtue, and so on. So essentially, it's saying that, like I said before, it's taking into account all these other things instead of just looking at pleasure or pain. So it's kind of expanding the viewpoint, which is important because it's not just happiness. If you look at the image here, it's also justice and knowledge. So it kind of expands the hedonistic view, and it takes into account more things. Pluralism about values also enables consequentialists to handle many of the problems that plague hedonistic utilitarianism. So essentially, that's what I just said, but it solves some of those other bigger issues in hedonism by kind of wrapping more things into it. So it kind of gets rid of the critiques, almost like the holes in the theory, so to speak. They kind of go by the wayside. Pluralists can hold that knowledge is intrinsically good and or that false belief is intrinsically bad. So false belief, you kind of got to think of lying in the sense, they pluralists they can say that lying is bad, maybe not from a pleasure or pain perspective, but still it shouldn't be done. And knowledge is important. It's important to grow your viewpoint, learn about more things. Um, so it's essentially just kind of expanding on that. It's taking more things into account, like I just said. Variations of ethical theory. We have actual versus expected consequentialism. So other responses claim that moral rightness depends on foreseen, foreseeable, intended, or likely consequences rather than actual ones. So that's kind of like expected, what you think is going to happen. Um, it's not what's actually going to happen, though. It's more of what you expect, sort of, so to speak. If actual consequences are what determine moral wrongness, then it was morally wrong for Alice to buy the bus ticket for this runaway. So this kind of goes back to something talked about in the encyclopedia, but essentially, there's a runaway girl, and you, as the agent, you buy her a ticket, to escape her bad life or whatever's going on. And on that bus ride, she gets into an accident, and the bus explodes, and she dies. Um, So it's essentially wrong to save that girl from her bad life if you look at the actual consequences because she died. If you didn't buy her that bus ticket, she wouldn't die. But if you looked at the expected, you didn't expect her to die. She shouldn't have died. There's no reason to think when you buy that ticket, oh, that girl should have died. So you're still not doing the wrong thing. You're doing the right thing, even though the wrong thing happens, kind of. And if you're looking at it through an expected consequence, looking at actual, then you did a terrible thing. You, you shouldn't have bought her the ticket, and you're not doing what is good. You're causing harm. Consequentialist moral theories that focus on actual or objective probable consequences are often described as objective consequentialism. In contrast, consequentialist moral theories that focus on intended or foreseen consequences are usually described as subjective consequentialism. So these are like other smaller kind of variations when you're talking about actual versus expected. And then if you look at the image here, it kind of just sums it up as a chart. You go from the actual, so they both have the action. The action's the same, but you do the action based on the actual consequences and then the expected consequences. So it kind of changes what is morally right and morally wrong, depending on which lens you're looking at it through in certain situations. Rights, reactivity, and rules. So classic utilitarianism implies it would not be morally wrong for the doctor to perform the transplant. Okay, so we're getting into the transplant case here, which is the doctor who has a patient. That patient is healthy, but they have organs that can be given to the five dying patients. The dying patients, that will be the only way they live is if that one person gets, performed surgery on, and then they will ultimately die because of it. That is the only way those five will live is if that one is essentially sacrificed by the doctor. So this is saying it would not be morally wrong for the doctor to perform the transplant. So essentially, if you're looking at it through a utilitarianism lens, you're doing more good by saving more people. But if we kind of think this through logically, we can't go around sacrificing, some people so others live. It kind of makes you think that this isn't really the best way of thinking in that sense. So there's other like consequentialist views that come up with ways to, kind of justify or not justify the decision. They modify utilitarianism to bring it in line with common moral intuitions. This is like what some of the consequentialist theories do. You think what's morally right and just kind of the common views of society, and you kind of bring that in so it's less, abstract and it's more applicable in daily life because you can't just, go around sacrificing people, Everyone would tell you that's just not feasible and wouldn't make sense in a society. It could be legitimate for an observer to judge that the world with the transplant is better, while it is also legitimate for the doctors as agents to judge that the world with the transplant is worse. So this is like the agent-centered view. You kind of look if you're looking through the doctor's lens. For the doctor, it might make the world worse because they are, I'm going against their oath that says do no harm or, save your patient. You're going against that. So if you're looking from the doctor perspective, you're doing the wrong thing by sacrificing all those people, and that just doesn't make sense. So if you look at it from like an agent-centered view, then it's kind of different than a neutral observer view. So that's what this last bullet point saying. Agent relative consequentialism isn't supposed to capture common sense moral institutions in such cases. This is kind of like a justification for the transplant case to say, yeah, we shouldn't do this. It kind of stops that almost hole of thinking, that plot hole, that just doesn't make sense. To sacrifice that one person who's healthy for those other dying people. So it kind of bridges the gap between more like theoretical thinking and actual like applicable thinking for daily life. So this is rights, reactivity, and rules continued. So we're going to start with agent relative still, but agent relative consequentialists can assign more weight to the welfare of a friend of an agent. Essentially, you look at the loved ones around you, you look at your family, you're going to be more likely to save your family. And, if you're looking from an agent relative view, they can say, oh, it makes sense for that person to save their child drowning in the pool rather than saving that other person that they don't know. So it kind of, instead of looking at just the black and white good, it kind of takes into perspective the agent that's performing the action. An indirect consequentialist holds that the moral qualities of something depend on the qualities of something else. So this is kind of like similar, it depends, things depend upon each other, you can't just sit back from a neutral view sometimes. The moral consequences of an act depend on the consequences of a rule. So that's more like rule centered, rule utilitarianism, like this image here. But essentially, it's saying that you follow the societal rules and the societal norms. So if you read the last bullet point, it says rule utilitarianism provides a way to remain consequentialist and yet capture the common moral intuition. So you kind of look at the society and you say, okay, most people think this is right. Um, you can still be a consequentialist because you're saying what's doing the most good because this is what society thinks is doing the most good. So it kind of is another way to bridge the gap and essentially take multiple perspectives into it instead of just at the black and white good. So to get into our objections and critiques, the requirement to maximize utility thus strikes many people as too demanding because it interferes with the personal decisions that most of us view should be up to the individual. So the encyclopedia kind of gets into it, but it talks about how, if you're really being a utilitarianism, you're donating all your money to charity. The author says, why am I being a teacher? Why am I instructing people on ethics? I should go be in the Peace Corps, or I should go be doing the most good that I can, in a way. So it kind of gets to a slippery slope. Like you don't really have autonomy if you're following utilitarianism because you're just doing what's best for society instead of taking your own actions and feelings into account. If it is morally wrong to do anything other than what maximizes utility, then it is morally wrong for me to buy the shoes. So the author kind of talks, he uses shoes as an example, if there's $100 for shoes and you have old shoes, you want new ones, these are uncomfortable, they're just not good for you. Or you can donate that $100 to charity, you know. If you're looking at maximizing utility, then you shouldn't get the new shoes. You shouldn't get new anything. It's morally wrong. You should be doing what's best for charity because that's helping other people instead of just looking out for yourself. So most of what people do is morally wrong because most people rarely maximize utility. So this is saying because most people, pretty much everyone, they're not just donating all their money to charity and sacrificing their own lives and, living out of a cardboard box, they have to take themselves into an account. So if ever you're taking, your own feelings, your own actions into account, like, um, then what you're usually doing is morally wrong in that sense. But then there's kind of a more normal way of thinking, which is saying that giving $1,000 to charity is better and more right than giving 100. That because that's kind of more of a scale. Just the more you can do, the better. But you don't have to be perfect because it says that most people aren't going to be perfect. You can't do everything. It just doesn't make sense feasibly. So hence there is no agreement on which theories count as consequentialist. So yeah, if we go back to the beginning when the author in this encyclopedia talks about consequentialism, one objection is that it's kind of hard for people to consider what is consequentialist and what is not, and there's kind of some debate over what terms are what. Um, a definition solely in terms of consequences might seem too broad because it includes absurd theories such as the theory that an act is morally right if it increases the number of goats in Texas. So, you might say goats in Texas, that's totally random. How does that apply? And that's true. Because if you're just looking at what is morally right, what is the morally right? Some people might think it's, the goats in Texas, there's different viewpoints, and you kind of got to think, that doesn't make sense because some people can have viewpoints that just aren't feasible, they just don't make sense or they're wrong or they're misinformed or stuff like that. Now to get into hedonism lowers the value of life to the level of animals. So essentially, animals just kind of doing what's pleasurable and avoiding what's painful. Are we really animals as humans? Are we really just looking for like the quick high, just doing whatever gives us the most pleasure? That kind of makes us seem like animals in a sense because that's what they do. So it kind of almost dumbs humans down in a way. Some critics argue that not all pleasures are valuable. So I touched on this before talking about hedonism, but drug abuse or stuff like that, that's not valuable. You're not providing anything to society. You're being a burden in a lot of ways. Just because it might feel good in that moment, you're not doing good for society as a whole, and it just doesn't make sense. It's just pursuing happiness and pleasure like that. It doesn't help anyone else. Hedonism overlooks the value of real friendship, knowledge, freedom, and achievements. So, you're just looking at pleasure. You're not looking at knowledge. You could be just getting high on drugs all day. You're not pursuing knowledge. You're not having any autonomy. You're not, finding connections with other people. You're not achieving things. There's no personal satisfaction. So it kind of just takes away from all of that and it fails to take other things into account. It's kind of like one dimensional, two dimensional in a sense. There's just you're just looking at it whether this is pleasurable or painful, but that's just not the way life works. There's too many other factors to take into account. That's kind of where a lot of people have objections to hedonism. So we must be able to compare the strengths of preference in order to determine whether doing A or not doing A would be better overall. So he kind of in the encyclopedia goes on a story, there's two different people. You compare what is right to one person or what is wrong to no, or what is right to another person, and there has to be a preference order, but it doesn't really make sense. How can you rank the preferences of one person over another? It kind of creates a bad view of thinking because you have to really rank every individual thing. So to continue with that, preference utilitarianism is often criticized on the grounds that some preferences are misinformed, crazy, horrendous, or trivial. So, I might have a preference and you might have a preference, but my preference could be terrible. My preference could be that I'm the only human on Earth and everyone else, should go extinct. That just doesn't make sense. How can you rank things when people have such horrible preferences that just don't make sense in society? Some consequentialists hold that an act is only right if and only if it maximizes some function of both happiness and capabilities. Disabilities are then seen as bad regardless of whether they are accompanied by pain or pleasure or loss of pleasure. So this is another example, where you're not thinking about the disabled people or the people that can't do things, because are you really like maximizing, function and capabilities? I mean, not really in a sense, because disabled people can't do everything that others can do. So it kind of leaves them out of it. If you're looking at it through that view, then we shouldn't have disabled people or something like that, because they're just not maximizing the pleasure or the pain. So it just doesn't really make sense as much. So one ethical idea slash argument that you agreed or disagree with. I actually agree with rule consequentialism in a way. I mean, it has some issues, but as a whole, I found it to be one of the things that makes a little bit more sense of consequentialism. Since the rule is an abstract entity, a rule by itself strictly has no consequences. So, a rule might not be made by society, it might just be random, like, oh, I can't walk outside on Thursdays or something like that. It's just an abstract viewpoint. It has no consequences, it has to be something that society agrees on as a whole. So, kind of when you look at rule consequences like that, um, some utilitarians conclude that it would not maximize utility for people generally to accept the rule that allows doctors to transplant organs from unwilling donors. So when in the entry, when the author talks about the transplant case, this is one of the few consequentialist views that says the doctor is completely right to not perform the transplant, because if you look at it from their view, they're violating their oaths, they're doing wrong in their profession, they're doing things that society wouldn't see as good. So essentially, it's not something that the people can agree on. So it kind of makes more exceptions. It kind of combines that like moral societal good kind of thing, where it has those common moral intuitions, they're thereby preserved. So that's just why I like rule consequentialism. You kind of have the moral intuition still there. You're not just saying, oh, let me kill this one person and save those other five, because that's just, living in a world of anarchy. There has to be kind of some societal rules that govern us or, show us how we should act. So that was my presentation. Thank you.